Hello and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. Dear listener, welcome to Series 7. I hope you are all well and had a great summer, or winter, depending on which hemisphere you're in. I just returned from seeing family and exploring my ancestral roots in Ireland. I'll be releasing a video on Patreon about my visit to Labacally Tomb in Cork. It was great to hear how much you enjoyed the 2 guest host takeover episodes during the summer, and big thanks again to Claire, Kate, Bethan and Icy. I'm so grateful to the many of you who have joined me on Patreon over the summer. I took a big step recently and decided to walk fully into doing this full time along with distant healing appointments. This has been a huge leap of faith for me, but I'm walking my talk and trusting my trip. Even though it does feel like stepping into the abyss, it feels right. The support and companionship of my Patreon community means a great deal to me, and I am looking forward to meeting many of you at the next Curious Crew online event in a couple of weeks. This time it will be a sigil workshop presented by one of our members. I'm really enjoying these get-togethers where we get to share our specialities to the rest of the group. We're kicking off the new series with a fantastic guest. Author Patrick Harpur will be well known to many of us for his book Demonic Reality, A Field Guide to the Otherworld. And I highly recommend reading The Philosopher's Secret Fire, A History of the Imagination, which I feel sheds a lot of light on the sorts of experiences we hear about here, along with his other non-fiction book, A Complete Guide to the Soul. Here we talk about his family's relationship with the otherworld, and whether an openness to their existence aids the potential for personal encounters. We ponder the eccentricity of our modern Western culture in denying the existence of these daemons. And Patrick offers ideas about which gods may be ruling us at this time. I hope you enjoy this discussion. Let me know on Instagram and Twitter. I have some wonderful personal experience shares coming up in the following episodes of this series. In the bonus episode, Patrick reveals his fascinating childhood treasure-finding experience. There's something about it which reminds me we are all born curious, with a foot in this world and arguably one still in the other world from whence we came. To stay connected in this material plane, we should endeavour to remain curious. Time to Hello everybody and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, and I am delighted to have with me author Patrick Harpur. Many of the people that watch and listen to this podcast will have read his fantastic book, Demonic Reality, A Field Guide to the Otherworld. He's also written a number of other excellent books, The Philosopher's Secret Fire, A History of the Imagination, and The Secret Tradition of the Soul, among a number of novels. Patrick's work suggests new ways to approach and understand otherworldly experiences, including dreams and visions from a Platonic philosophy, Jungian perspectives, Renaissance magic, and tribal perspectives, as well as various models of the universe. Thank you very much for joining us, Patrick. Welcome.
You're welcome, Jo. Yeah, as you've just said, it's not a new way of looking at things at all. It's a very old way that I've cobbled together out of different bits of different disciplines, because there's a lack of cross-disciplinary reference these days, that you have to go right across the board to compose a daimonic worldview, see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is why many of us find your books immensely helpful, because you have this clarity of vision with it, and you're able to bring these, whether they are the older kind of philosophies or the new perspectives of different world models, and be able to present that in a way that is really clear and it's extremely insightful. So, we're very thankful for what you've been doing and what you continue to do.
Very
Um,
kind. Thank you.
so, like myself, your family were, quite open to these sorts of ideas of there being other worlds and these beings that may emerge from those other worlds. I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and whether you think that that's important in terms of experiencing. It seems to me, talking to guests on my podcast and as part of my research, that there's often at home a kind of open way of approaching these ideas.
Yes, yes. Yes, I was very fortunate in that respect, but I was never conflicted, that supernatural experiences were not poo-pooed in my family at all. In fact, my mum was very keen on them. Both my parents were Christians, but in a very undemanding way. In those days, you went to church twice a year or something like that. But they did lead me to. They did sort of hint at the idea that religion was the most important thing. It wasn't really openly discussed, but I just got the idea that God was very important. But then at a lower level, my mother was very interested in spiritualism, and that was because her own mother, my grandmother, had been a very, very good medium. She did automatic writing. And sometimes, during the war particularly, she used to have quiet times where she'd go into a semi-trance. And it was rather frightful, really, because she would quite often get dead soldiers coming through who were a bit bewildered and lost. And my mother would have to be on hand to talk to them. She'd have to talk them down, as it were, And so she got and she was a very young, quite a young girl at that stage, about 19 or 20. There was one quite chilling instance, actually, in which one of the soldiers that came through my grandmother was a soldier that she knew, not very well, but an acquaintance, and he was saying, "Good Lord, Alicia, that's her name, what are you doing here? You've changed your hair," and things like that, really quite striking. Anyway, my mother was very interested in spiritualism, and wherever she moved, she always made sure to get hold of the local medium. She'd always go along, especially healing mediums. As children, we were quite often wheeled along to some medium to have our petty ailments healed and so on. So we were quite happy with that idea. We thought it was a bit wacky, but, we humoured our mum, it was great. My father didn't say much, but in fact, he was the deeply psychic one. But he was, he'd been in the war and had been shot, his nerves had been shot to bits in the war and so on. And he's knuckled down to a career in business. He worked in Fleet Street. And so he didn't really talk much about it. But he never, he never contradicted my mother or said it was rubbish or anything like that. And indeed, he was happy to recount his own fairy sightings as a teenager, So he lived with that. His fairy sightings were all the more unusual, I should add, because he came from a long line of Church of Ireland Protestant clergymen, and the Protestant culture was, of course, more English than Irish, really. Well, it was, the Anglo-Irish are sort of trapped between the two worlds, But he'd had experiences, and his sister had also had experiences of fairies, which suggests, of course, that it's not what fairies weren't in their culture, but they saw them nevertheless, as it were, suggesting that fairy sightings are more to do with the place and the state of mind of the percipient than it is to do with cultural expectations and so on.
Healing has helped me many times in my life when I'd reached a point where something needed to change. In 2005, I trained with Martin Brofman to learn the body mirror system of healing, which was life-changing for me. It's based on the idea that the parts of your body that don't work well reflect the parts of your life that don't work well, and about which you have tension in your consciousness. The understanding is that tension is stress, and stress causes symptoms. In a distance healing or in-person session, I move up the chakras, returning each one to wholeness using a colour map. During the process, I see images and situations, I hear words or receive impressions that tell me something about what caused the tension in that person's life. The feedback at the end of the session is a really big part of the healing. If you're interested in a chakra healing session, you can contact me at scarletofthefae@gmail.com. Yeah, it might suggest that, mightn't it? And even it seems to me, speaking to people, that it does seem to run in families too. It does seem to move through generations. Now, whether that is teaching just way of being and being open or something else, we don't know. But I do find that interesting that you will get mothers, grandmothers, and the the grandchildren all reporting experiences without, sometimes without knowing that the grandmother did as well. So
I see. Right.
Yeah.
I have 3 siblings. Of the 4 of us, only one of us, my brother, has seen anything funny. Really, It's not quite true. I've seen a fairy light in Ireland.
Right.
It wasn't a light that I'd come to expect from the literature. It was like a flare going up in the air. Well, I know for a fact that it wasn't an actual flare because of where it came from, which is the middle of a bog. My only point of contact with that was reading of W.B. Yeats, seeing exactly the same thing. He saw a flare-like light shoot up into the sky, quite slowly, not, quite flare-like, in other words.
Yeah.
And so I was encouraged by that comparison to believe that I'd seen a fairy light. My brother has seen fairy lights, and he saw them at my other brother's house, where we were all gathered. And he came back into the house and said, "Quick, come out, there's fairy lights on the other side of the river." Nobody could be bothered because we were all eating and drinking, except me. I was keen. So I went out. The extraordinary thing is that I have... he actually punched me the other day because he said, "Do you remember those fairy lights?" And I said, "No, the trouble is I don't. I have no memory of it at all."
Yeah.
And that is a common thing also with daimonic events, isn't it? That sometimes you just don't remember,
It is interesting.
And it's something else reminds you, and it brings it to mind, and you do remember it. But in my case, I was reminded but didn't remember it. So I can't claim that any of my generation, in other words, have had very startling daimonic events, apart from my brother, who's seen fairy lights, he's seen a couple of UFOs and so on,
In a sense, what you've done with your work is, I would, perhaps describe as demonic in some senses, that you've been able to bring that through in a way that, masses are able to understand it. That may not have happened if you hadn't written that book. So there is that small thing.
Yes, well, that's true. That's true. But I think I speculate somewhere, sort of rather vaguely, that it may be the case that if you've already imaginatively taken in the idea of daimons, you sort of don't need to see them. That it's quite often people who don't believe in fairies at all and don't believe in UFOs at all who see them. It's almost as if they're being bludgeoned into some sort of recognition of the daimonic through their encounters. But I don't know if that holds true. I don't know, because I suppose you could equally argue that a lot of people who do believe in fairies do also see them. Did you believe in fairies before you saw yours?
I wasn't really into fairies at all. I wasn't, I think the last time I had an interest in fairies, And they weren't the kind of flower fairies, but just the stories from my dad. And it was always, children being in a lane somewhere in rural Ireland, because he was talking about his own youth, and that they get lost because they go off exploring, and then suddenly it's twilight and they come across, a fairy fort or somewhere, somewhere sacred in the landscape, or a fairy ring, and the idea of not going into the fairy ring. So I had stories like that. I was never really into fairies, and I'd never expected to see one at all. So yes, that was interesting. And in fact, the woman that I used to go and learn about auras and healing and things like that from, she had said she'd seen a fairy, and I just thought that was ridiculous. So yeah, I it's definitely not on the cards for me to see anything. So I guess in that respect, I am one of those examples of people that I wouldn't have expected to, although I was kind of open-minded. But in demonic reality or secret fire, you mentioned that there doesn't always have to be a message from that being. Just the simple fact of them appearing is the message itself. I agree with that just the fact that they turn up can be enough, because some people, if they hear about an experience that a person's had, they want to know about that encounter. Oh, what did this mean? What did this mean? But the fact of just, it's like a switch from not knowing and being completely unaware to sudden knowingness, and that changes you, and that's enough. Is that what you meant by that, do you think?
I may have been rationalizing the fact that there are quite a lot of encounters with no messages after the fact, if you see what I mean. But I do think there's a sense in which they are their own message, that their very appearance just automatically subverts the worldview that has been designed to exclude them. And people would do well most people have an experience of that kind, and we have no idea how many people have experiences like that and never mention them. I should think it's considerable, because they have nowhere to put them. There is nothing in our modern worldview which allows for fairies. They're just risible, So it may be that people just either forget it immediately, as I did, or else just put it in a separate box altogether, because they don't know what to do with it. And in a sense, that's partly why I wrote the book, because I thought, well, I'm quite happy with them. I think they appear, but I don't know where they fit in with anything, really, But of course, once you pursue fairy lore to its end, you begin to isolate certain characteristics of the fairies, their elusiveness, the fact they're always marginal, the fact that they're shapeshifters, the fact that they are contradictory and paradoxical at all times, including the worst one of all, that they seem to be both material and solid and evanescent and ethereal at the same time, or in quick succession. All these characteristics, began to sort of make sense to me as a sort of way of looking at the world, that they became a sort of metaphor for the way in which elusive, marginal, shape-shifting, paradoxical realities, such as we encounter in dreams and the imagination, may well be the foundation of reality, rather than this wacky byproduct. Because, in other words, you have to change your whole way of viewing the world in order to grasp fairies as a reality of some kind,
Yeah.
I think that's what I thought, yes.
Yeah, I mean, in that way, the Greeks seem to know a lot more than we do about these worlds, and kind of accepted them as this is the world and this is what it's like. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I wouldn't just say Greeks. I mean, one of the things that encouraged me in my explorations of the fairies was that it soon became apparent to me that there is no culture which doesn't believe in Daimons, including our own, before our uniquely eccentric modern post-Enlightenment age, And what's more, as far as I can tell, pretty much all of them have the same characteristics of the sort of attributes I've just listed. that the fairies have. It's true to say that they don't always take their own form, as it were, because in some cultures, the part of the fairies or the daimons is played by animals. And that's particularly true of animistic cultures. And in some cultures, it's played by the ancestors. So, you can have those three categories of daimons: animals, ancestors, and entities which are unique in themselves, like the Irish fairies are, for instance, or like the jinns are in Arabia, or the Quaishins are in China, or the Yunwetsunzi amongst the Cherokees, or whatever. Those are all, they all have their own being. They are all usually small and eccentric looking, Yes, in other words, it's not just the ancient Greeks who are happy with daimons, and the Romans, who were even more fervid. They were almost hysterical in their belief in daimons. That there's barely a rock or a tree or a stream or any natural object which doesn't have its attendant daimon. So it just occurred to me that it's we who are eccentric in not believing in them, or not taking them into account, and that maybe we should be interacting with them more, to prevent things like misfortune. That all these cultures took these entities, these creatures, into account, and were very respectful of them because they could wreak havoc. And as the Irish leave out milled butter, or used to, as a sort of offering, you feed the daimons. You make little sacrifices to them. You could leave things on your plate for them, things like that. Just little tokens, because they need to be acknowledged. They need to be not literally fed, but metaphorically heeded, so that they don't turn against us. And I don't know how many. I wonder how much misfortune is caused by our neglect of the daimons. Perhaps that's a whimsical thought, but
I just wonder whether you think that these ways are coming back, to be honest, because we do have lots of people that are very much interested in these subjects. There's just so many researchers like myself that are looking in to these experiences. And of course, we have the whole kind of UFO research going on in the background as well in the foreground for everybody else, but for me, I'm focused on fairies, but I'm aware that that's become really huge and mainstream. But in terms of fairies and the way that we even now relate to nature, there's definitely a resurgence and a different way of approaching these beings. I mean, if you think about fairy doors as well, and people leaving offerings, there's so much of this now, and a lot of young people are really into ritual, being aware of astrology and moon phases, etc., and are interested. Do you think that we might actually be returning, or at least becoming more aware again?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how widespread it is. I mean, you obviously think it is, but then you're very plugged into a community that understands that and believes in all that, and so I wonder if that's true. I wonder if it's true that it is as widespread as you say. I mean, I think it's never gone away. There were always people who believed in fairies. The trouble is, it was it got caught up in the division of culture in the 17th century. In the 16th century, everybody belonged to the same culture. That the same common people who looked at Midsummer Night's Dream in the Globe Theatre watching Shakespeare and the fairies on stage didn't have a different mindset from the educated courtiers who sat in the gallery. They were a one culture. But in the 17th century, the educated culture split from the common culture. So it's difficult to know whether the folklore of the common people has been continuous. and that they've always just got, and because they tend to be, before the Industrial Revolution anyway, closer to the land than the educated people, maybe they just went on believing in fairies while the educated people were banging their fists on the table and saying these do not exist, And maybe that is true today, in the sense that we don't have the oral folklore in Western societies anymore, but we do have this vast underground literature, which for instance, UFO literature, huge, fairy literature is considerable,
Yes.
but it's almost unknown to the educated classes, they're fringe subjects still, I think, aren't they? Are they mainstream in your experience?
I mean, they are definitely fringe. However, I think more and more people are interested, and it's definitely seems to be spreading. And there's lots about fairy beings and encounters and offerings and fairy doors and things like that on TikTok. You go to parks and there's fairy doors everywhere. If you look at any pieces of local news, you tend to find people are putting fairy themed events on. Anything to do with fairies is pretty big. It has been that way for, perhaps I'm going to say, fairy doors, definitely maybe the last 20 years, I would say, is when they sort of started, but now they're very, very popular. So I feel like there's something happening, and it just makes me wonder whether there's something about these times do they feel demonic to you, or is that not something that you really think about?
I don't know if you can talk about the times feeling demonic.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but maybe I'm out of touch. Maybe they are. I mean, I don't know how seriously to take the fairy doors and little girls wearing wings and
Yeah,
like that. It might be at the sort of level of Victorian whimsy about fairies.
oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. It may be that is sort of a symptom of a deeper groundswell, as you're suggesting. It may be. I have no idea. I haven't seen any real people really grappling with the daimonic, really.
Right. Yeah.
apart from us, but then
Yeah.
there's us, and there's people read my books. Not many, though. I have to say, it's I have a very, very small readership, so I myself am very, very fringe. So
I'm very surprised to hear that.
not a surprise
Certainly.
to me.
Everybody that I know absolutely raves about your books, and when I listen to
Well, I
other
rest my case.
podcasts,
You see, that means that you live in a particular milieu which is open.
Well, we could look at it like this then, that people have, including myself, and I'm not sure whether your family felt the same, your dad felt the same, were very reluctant to talk about their encounters. I know that eventually I did publicly, and the reason I did was because I'd been speaking to people about their encounters, and I felt that it was high time for me to talk about my own, if I was going to be asking other people. And it was a really, really big thing to do. But there's been some kind of a sea change, because I'm getting so many messages from people saying, I've never been able to talk about this before, and telling me their encounter, and they're actually willing to come on and be a guest. And of course, usually my guests are anonymous because they're talking about something very, very personal. But occasionally, I mean, just the other week, I spoke to a guy and he was saying, no, let's do a video. Let's go for it. And, people are willing not only to tell their stories, but kind of put their faces to it as well, which is, I think that feels like a sea change, but let's see. Let's watch this space and see how that goes.
I think it may be a phenomenon of the internet. There's something very intimate about the internet, and people are emboldened when they see others on screen talking about their experiences. But they will come forward, whereas before there was no outlet. You may tell your immediate family or friends who may or may not accept it.
Yeah.
But often people are quite puzzled and gnawed at by their experiences, and it's with relief that they find that there's now an outlet, that there are podcasts like yours dedicated to these subjects. And that, in a sense, makes it respectable. Others come forward, and the more people come forward, the more people come forward. I'm thinking too of, for instance, the American Bigfoot websites.
Yeah.
Thousands upon thousands of wonderful stories, which, when I was writing my book, I had to plow through libraries of works to get encounters and sightings. But there are millions told by the experiencers themselves now on the internet. It is wonderful. And
it is.
I even got onto a Dogman website the other day. That was a thing I'd never even heard of. But bloody hell, people are seeing these dog-headed creatures everywhere. Extraordinary stories. The veracity of which I have no reason to doubt. You can tell by the tone of their voice that it was the most appalling encounter. Anyway,
no, it's so true.
So it may be that these things actually, people were always seeing stuff, and and they're less marginalized now because we live in a more fluid culture where the internet is specially designed for people who are fringe. And so maybe the resurgence is just an artifact of this greater access, or maybe people really are more often seeing funny things. I don't know. It's impossible to say, really.
It is. And I mean, sort of talking about, touching on Dogman there and different sorts of beings, I note that you, like myself, include creatures like werewolves, Sasquatch, and all sorts of other sorts of beings. I'm putting them all in a fairy bracket because I'd like to research them. And so when people come to me, one guy saw what seemed like a werewolf on a mountain. This was in Spain, but it was just defeating all the natural laws by kind of going through walls. And as you were mentioning before, he was both that this beast was both material and not material, because he was being able to go through walls, but at the same time he was able to affect the foliage around him and make that shake.
Right.
And there was yes. a sound coming from him as well. But he was definitely otherworldly. And so, I find that's good to know that you're kind of grouping them into these daemons, these otherworldly beings. What do you how would you describe a daemon for people that aren't that familiar? How would you describe them to people, these daemons? What would make something a daemon and something else, say, a ghost?
Well, I think there's a big overlap between daemons and ghosts. They're not hard and fast either.
No, especially poltergeist.
They are paradoxical, marginal, elusive, shape-shifting creatures. I mean, Socrates had a very interesting take on daimons, and he was an expert because he had a personal daimon, the most famous one in antiquity. And the reason that I wrote my book about the soul really was a lot of it recapped what I'd done before, but I'd left out the personal daimon in my other works, and I wanted to write more about that. That was one of the impetuses behind that book. But he said that, that the purpose of daimons is to convey the will of the gods to men and the wishes of men to the gods. So the gods, they're the way that the gods communicate to us their will. And we, in turn, entreat the daemons to convey our wishes to the gods. I think that's true of the personal daimon in a way that it's not probably true of a fairy you might run into on Exmoor. It doesn't seem to be conveying any message, except, possibly the one that I've already said. His very appearance is a kind of message.
Yeah.
And I don't see that he conveys our wishes to the gods necessarily. So, but they do have Socrates was pointing to another characteristic of them, which is as mediators.
Yes.
So I think they do, in some sense, because of their very contradictory nature, they mediate between different states of nature, different states of mind, hence their liking for borders. Literally, they often appear in border-like places, seashores or crossroads or whatever. In the case of big black cats in Britain, they like quarries and railway lines. I don't know what that's about, but my sister is the expert on that. She's written the best single study of Daimons, I think, that there is, probably, on mystery big cats. So those are the main characteristics of the daimonic. But as I'm always saying, they're also the same characteristics that are displayed by the unconscious or the imagination. That we can only catch the daimons by using a faculty, the imagination, which is as quick and as marginal and as shape-shifting as they are, as it were. And so their very appearance is like an appearance out of the great collective imagination in order to expand our own imaginations and force us to embrace a much wider conception of what reality, or what I might laughingly call reality, a much wider conception of reality than we had before.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely does.
Something like that, anyway.
It does. It does seem to be like that for people, that there's this, they have these experiences, and then there's a shift in their perception of reality that is much needed. I mean, I think we all need a different perspective sometimes. I think we can sort of go through life just sort of not really being present in any way, and just going through the motions with things. And I think when you have an experience like that, it kind of wakes you up to maybe what your life path is. And perhaps that for a lot of people is the message. This is what you need to be doing, and not in so many words, but it just kind of wakes them up, and they start to think about things, and they start to, realize some important aspects of their life that need to be dealt with. I mean, one thing that I'm particularly interested in is the way that they appear to people as well. I mean, you have touched on this as well, is that, they're all awesome. The response is one of awe. And yet sometimes these beings, it's just a beautiful, wonderful experience for that person. And in other times, it's absolutely terrifying. But it's not that they are, well, my understanding, and I think you've mentioned this as well, that they're not trying to be either. They just are. And I guess, our thoughts are that it's how we are perceiving them through a kind of human framework. Do you have anything else to say there about the way that they appear and how we respond?
Yes. The trouble is that encounters with daimons aren't always. I'm quickly scanning my list of fairy encounters,
Yes.
But they're not always awesome. I mean, they may be awesome to us, but they wouldn't be awesome to an 18th century Irish farm labourer.
Right.
So it may be that as you're suggesting, really, that it's difficult to know whether it's awe or just simple shock. I mean, a lot of people just are shocked, so they just don't know what to make of this thing. So awe and terror would be kind of intermingled. But our response to the daimons is almost like an aspect of their own ambiguity. That they can sometimes be benign and sometimes be malevolent. And I don't know, I think it was Yeats who said that, if you see them first, they're going to be malevolent. But if they see you first, they're going to be benign, something like that. He had some quite sophisticated epistemology attached to seeing fairies. So I don't know what the answer is. I think that, yes, I think what you bring to it, I think you're right, that they are just themselves, but they are complicated and ambiguous. And we can see them as benign or malevolent. We can be frightened or awed in a delightful way by them, depending on what we bring to that encounter ourselves. An open-minded person, who's always sort of thought at the back of their mind that fairies might exist, would be delighted to see one, but a hard-boiled rationalist would be appalled, So I think maybe that's the answer, yes.
I think, it is interesting speaking to people, and, they never sort of react in the way that they think they would react either way, whether they are a rationalist or, a fan of fairies. How did your father talk to you about his own experience and what was that like for him?
He was fairly neutral about it. I think he was very surprised. He was sitting under a tree in a place called Muckross Abbey, which is quite a famous abbey. He was waiting for his sister. It's near Killarney. And he just looked up. And in the ruins of the abbey, he could see 3 small figures quite near him, but, 60 feet away, 20 meters, something like that. And 2 of them were fighting or tussling. They had a bag. They were tussling over this bag, pulling it to and fro. And there was a 3rd fairy, much older, very wizened little man, dressed in sort of, quite 18th century frock coaty type of garment, And he was looking on them tolerantly, as if they were children squabbling. And he suddenly looked up and looked at my father, and their eyes met, and poof, they disappeared like that, Classic. His sister's experience was, well, I remember actually, I remember we used to go every year on holiday to Ireland to visit relatives and so on. And I remember we'd park the car to have a picnic, and we'd unloaded all the stuff and laid out the picnic. And suddenly my father said, "Right, we're going." We said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Pack up now." And he was present with us was his sister, who'd also seen the fairies. She was his older sister, the aunt who lived in Ireland, who he stayed with, and she backed him up and said, "Don't argue, just get, pack up and get in the car." And of course, we'd picnic at a suitable spot, which happened to be a fairy fort, and my father had just known that we were not welcome there,
Yes.
And he didn't say much about it. He just said, they don't want us there. We're moving on,
No, this is it.
And we were all a bit sort of subdued by this. We could see he was deadly serious, which he wasn't often, but when he was, it was frightening, so we all knuckled under. But his sister, I don't know if I should be telling you this. Yeah, I think I will.
Don't need to.
Yeah, I know I don't need to, but his sister had a very unnerving experience. She was very friendly with the local Church of Ireland vicar, where she lived in County Laois. And he died suddenly, and she was very upset by this because, he was a great chum of hers and so on. And she was sitting in her orchard. She had quite a nice farmhouse. They had land. And she suddenly heard voices, and she thought, funny, I don't remember leaving the radio on or anything like that, She sounded like sort of distant playing of the radios, just, little voices talking to and fro and so on. And she looked around, and suddenly she saw this dead vicar standing in the orchard with about 4 or 5 little people, little fairies,
Goodness.
standing around him. 2 of them had hold of his cassock. And he was looking rather pale and shaken, to be honest, things like that. And I thought it was so interesting because, part of fairy lore is you're particularly vulnerable to abduction when you're in an in-between state, before you've been baptized or before a mother who's had a child is churched after giving birth. And before this was, after he died, but before the funeral, so he was in an in-between state, as it were. Yeah. It's almost as if, the fairies had got his soul, It reminded me of the classic story of the Reverend Kirk, in Scotland, who died standing on his fairy fort, as it were. He had a heart attack, or did he, But we say he died of a heart attack on the fairy fort. Others say, no, he was touched by the fairies, had a stroke, died, and was taken by the fairies, And it's still rumoured that there's no body in his coffin, just stones, because he's in the other world, but the other world fairy, not the other world of the Christian heaven, so on. So my aunt's story was, had a lot of resonance for me, and is quite disconcerting,
Yeah, it makes me wonder whether he was even, from another perspective, whether he was aware of those beings in his lifetime.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know anything about that. Yeah.
And he could have been.
He could easily. Yeah, easily. Yes.
It's very interesting.
I don't know, but he's not the first, and he won't be the last dead person to be seen amongst the fairies.
Absolutely.
The dead and the fairies are interchangeable. Yeah.
Quite so. Absolutely. I think in terms of the other world as well, one of the things that you mention is that, to every person, another person is an other world, as in they're a mystery. And I like that idea too, is that, within us, we contain all of these mysteries. Like, for instance, we have no idea whether that priest had an awareness of the fairies and what his own private approach to these worlds are. And, we don't know from one to the other. And that we do, within our own consciousness, have these endless possibilities. Can you say any more about that at all?
No, except that if you subscribe to a completely different worldview from the modern one, as I do, I more or less, there are going to be overlaps, obviously, between worldviews, but deep down, I believe in the pre-scientific revolution worldview, in which everything is connected by analogy in the great chain of being, and so on. And if you believe in that world, if you believe in the world as above, so below, that everything is analogous to everything else, you believe that, for instance, we are all microcosms of the greater macrocosm. In other words, that we are the great world in miniature. And as such, there is no boundary between us, or there isn't a boundary in the same way as we now think, between us and the outside world. In other words, we all exist in the same, we're all images in the same psychic space, or as I would call it, the imagination, or possibly the soul of the world. These are the various models I run through, and they're all equally, they're all analogous to each other. And so it wouldn't be surprising if we're all sort of individual souls within a greater field of soul, as it were. It wouldn't be at all surprising if we were all equally mysterious to each other, but equally porous to each other. And that amongst the images that exist in the soul of the world, there aren't just human images, there are also images of all sorts of other creatures and entities who exist on an equal footing with us. That's an absolute standard belief in the earliest and most widespread worldview, animism, as it's rather bestially called, But for animists, people in the Amazon, people in Siberia, large parts of the Americas, they just think that everything is soul, and every image in the world, every natural object, including ourselves, is an image in the soul.
Yes.
And which has a more or less fluid relationship with the material. But, we are pretty much material, but other creatures can sort of move in and out of materiality and so on. Because, soul, imagination is a fluid field which is entirely composed of images.
Within that, there's this sense of, from speaking to people, there's this sense of recognition. And I think what you were just describing there is in some ways kind of related to that, and that there's this knowingness. So sometimes, even between two people, not just even with a person and another worldly being, you'll get this sense of recognition.
Yes.
And it's unmistakable. And sometimes people talk to me about this when they're describing their encounter, that there's this, I kind of felt like I knew it from somewhere, or they felt familiar to me. There's a familiarity. And we do get that between people as well. So it really, I do find that very interesting, that we're, sometimes I could describe it like this, that we're in the supermarket and we're doing our shopping, and if somebody's standing behind us or somebody walks past, we almost get a sense of who that person is. There's a sense, not that we knew them from another time, but almost that we can kind of sense from them something about their lives. And what you were describing about this kind of this porousness between us, I feel like that definitely, I've definitely felt that with other people. But yeah, this sense of familiarity and recognition that could potentially be just our recognition of the soul world and knowing it for that moment,
Yes,
just
I
enough
think
for
that's
us.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, I think that's what it is. I think since we're all primarily souls, as the Neoplatonists would say, that if we can brush past another soul, and whenever you make contact with another person's soul, which is concealed beneath their bodies, we have that little frisson, that moment of recognition. And indeed, since we all participated in the great world soul, it may be that we are attracted by similarity of experience or similarity of temperament, and people often put that down to, for instance, saying, "Oh well, we must have known each other in another life," or something like that, which is a sort of quite a nice metaphor for. I mean, I don't think it's literally true, probably, but it's a nice metaphor for the idea that that in our innermost being, in our souls, we have an affinity with certain other souls, which would normally just be concealed by our appearance, by our material bodies and so on.
It's very
So I think
true.
that may well be true, and that I think is what things like synchronicity are about. But synchronicities aren't useful in any way, but they have a sort of meaning. But they're not mysterious if you think that we're all. If you think of the outer world as not being outer, as it were, as us containing it, and also being contained by it. But the world, it shouldn't be surprising that our inner life should have correspondences with the outer world at certain moments, whether it's meeting a kindred spirit, as we say, or whether it's some event or something happening which seems to us so amazing that it can't possibly be coincidence. It's more like providence than coincidence, something like that. From my, archaic worldview, that wouldn't be surprising at all.
Mm. It almost sounds as if perhaps the veil drops for that moment, whether it be, seeing the other worldly being or something about that contact with a person or a place or a situation triggers the outer world to suddenly shift for a moment or drop in some way where we kind of see the truth beneath it and the soul beneath it and recognize that. People talk about being seen. Maybe it's just one of
Yes,
those types of moments.
yes, I think that's right. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that as a child, then you experienced healing. I mean, that's something that I personally find very interesting. Was that your sort of one of your first sort of sense of awareness of possibilities of healing? What was that like?
Oh well, it was just my mum's eccentricity. She'd really. I mean, I remember having a healer come and lay hands on me when I was really quite young, about 5 or something like that. I thought it was a bit odd, but I put up with it. My mother thought it was a good idea, but wasn't great pains to experience it to me. But later in life, I did actually need a healer, and I found a good one, or rather, my mother went to one and urged me to go. And she thought that I had healing powers myself and offered to train me up. And I did go along a bit and sort of have a go. And she assured me that I was doing okay, but it didn't really stick with me. And I don't know how true it was. I have no idea. But she did sort me out from quite a dark place, and she did it instantaneously. So I was very, very impressed by her. I was a bit sort of psychologically messed up, and she just did one session, and it was like I could see colours again. She just cleared me up in one go. So I'm a strong believer in healers, but they vary a lot in quality. I've seen enough to know that I don't think I've ever I've never not met a charlatan. They're all sincere, but some of them fancy themselves as healers, I think, which
Yeah.
is quite different from being good at it.
Yeah, no, you're right, and it's the same with any kind of any
Yeah,
kind of profession, I guess, as well, isn't it? But yeah, you're right there. But I think your mum was right in that, faith is really important. I think it helps people, particularly in difficult times, to have some kind of faith. I think, and any faith, to be honest, I think is helpful, whatever it is, because it's something that you can, turn to. It seems that way to me.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree. Not that she went to faith healers.
No.
And she believed that they were technicians, that they
Yeah.
knew how to, just as my grandmother could channel people, she thought others could channel healing powers, and she just regarded that as a normal thing for some people to be able to do. And I think she's right, yes. Yeah. But yes, but she also had faith. I mean, she believed in God, so that was all good.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll see how this all pans out with this latest interest in fairies and the research around fairies and encounters. And I think, more and more people will be finding your work because they're interested in these subjects. I could see demonic reality as some kind of documentary series where you might be able to sort of, look into things. I'd love to see something like that. Do you think that would ever be on the cards?
Well, no one's ever asked me.
Oh, they should.
Well, I have been asked to sort of feature in the odd documentary. It's true to say, stick in my 2 cents worth, but and to be honest, I don't think I'd do it. I think you need the long. Well, I don't know. I might do it. It's moot anyway, but you do need a long sort of run up, to talk about the full sort of context of fairy lore, which is only really available in a book, where you can digress and speculate and philosophize, that sort of thing. I'm not sure it lends itself to the soundbite.
No,
But of
it could
course,
be.
it's always interesting to hear of people's experiences. I mean, I do it for that alone, actually, just to meet people with wonderful tales to tell,
Yeah.
and then, but to expand the whole worldview, which makes fairy experiences intelligible, takes a book, really. Takes more than one book, to be honest. But
Well, they're both, I mean, the two that I haven't got Mercurius, I must get that one. And I want to get stuck into your novels as well because they look fantastic, especially The Good People. I really should have that. So I'm going to get that.
well, that's a sort of companion volume to Daimonic Reality.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing reporting experiences, but if you have a novelistic instinct, you want to get inside it all. You want to do people who have, you want to do people who have those experiences. You don't want to expound it about it objectively. So there was always a bit of me regretting Daimonic Reality was a non-fiction book, So I wrote a fiction book as a companion to it, really. Yeah. So,
That's amazing. Well, I think it would really work well as documentary series.
you mentioned Mercurius, you see, but I mean, that's the realm of alchemy. I mean, that was my initiation into the other world. I did stick a UFO in Mercurius, but I wasn't very interested in that sort of thing. But as a result of studying alchemy, all sorts of things began to become clear to me. It's a very profound discipline, and it combines so many. It combines all your faculties. It's chemistry and metallurgy, and at the same time, philosophy, art. Imagination. It's fantastic. That's why my Mercurius is so long. It's the longest book I wrote because really it's 2 books. It's a non-fiction and fiction book combined.
So I have never got into alchemy properly, and so perhaps that's my next rabbit hole that I'll go down. I probably sort of won't rise to the surface for another 5 years if I go down that avenue. I think I'll probably.
My advice is, Joe, don't.
Okay.
Yeah, that way madness lies. Yeah, it's for yeah.
I think I'll read the book.
Yes, read the book and see if you fancy it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it does look excellent. And this Philosopher's Secret Fire as well is just a fantastic book.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely brilliant. And so much for people that are interested in understanding the other worlds, the encounters with fairies. I mean, two really useful books. And I, for one, would very much like to see that as a documentary series. So please do that sometime.
Well, the trouble is people want explanations, don't they? I don't give explanations.
I think there's I think you do in your writing. It's very clear.
I think I make them intelligible. Yes, I think I think it gives people a handle on them, but nothing can explain that. They're not problems to be solved.
No,
they're mysteries you enter into, as I always say. So an encounter is an initiation. It's not an observation.
Well, this is it. In my research, I'm definitely not trying to convince people of the existence of fairies. That's not what I'm interested in. And a lot of other people feel the same. It's more about just, talking about them and finding out how it was for different people who want to kind of talk about it. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is what you thought, what myth are we going through at this time? And if we're seeing kind of, the peak of enlightenment or the peak of scientism that we're in now, I would argue that perhaps, what we saw with, through the sort of COVID times, that's sort of peak scientism that we're in at the moment. Then if we're moving away from scientism, which we might equate with the way that, and through the Enlightenment, we might equate that with ego. If we're perhaps moving away from ego and towards a heart-centered culture instead in a modern Western society, then being able to be seen for who we are, whatever form that takes, it's got to be central to feel accepted. But I do wonder if we are all living our myths, and if the world is its own consciousness, then what myth is the pervading myth at the moment that we're stepping through? I do wonder about that.
Or asking which of the the thing about imagination is it is self-limiting. It's not infinite, and we know that because all mythologies have a set number of gods in the pantheon. That there are only certain perspectives through which you can view the world. But yet all the gods interact with each other, they fight and intermarry and so on. So it's very hard to single them out. But so you could be asking what god is behind, modern society.
What do you think?
You could see how the goddesses arose, that Hera was in charge of the housewife of the 50s, and then up rose Athena, who is unmarried, warrior-like, wise. You can see she's the goddess behind feminism, for example, and then there's Artemis, also unmarried, and so on. Yes. She's the god of the hunt, of nature, of and also of childbirth, which is bizarre, strange. But I think that indicates she might be an agent who brings creativity out of other people. And you can see she's one of the goddesses behind ecology. I mean, Gaia's obviously a strong one, but there's an Artemisian side to the eco warriors,
Absolutely.
With their insistence on absolute purity, that the thing is that Artemis must never be violated. Actaeon, who peaked on her bathing, that was illegitimate. You don't look at Artemis, naked, otherwise you get torn to death by your own hounds, by yourself, in other words, So you can see, that's a very simplistic way of putting it, but you can see how movements in society could be, underpinned by psychological perspectives and forces which used to be called gods and which Jung called archetypes. And I'm not sure. I know that Hermes is in charge of the internet, for instance, being god of communication, but also, the arch trickster. So we'll see. Yes, and I haven't decided which god is now in charge of our modern madness. Yes, Mars has really the Ares, the war god, has raised his ugly head, and so forth. That came out of the blue. That's the thing about the gods; they burst in on us,
Very true.
Very true. We think we know what's going to happen, the end of history, as was announced in 1990. Well, how did that work out? So I'm not sure if we're going to break through into a higher level of consciousness and a re-participation in nature. I think it's more cyclical. That we go back to older things. Rather than I'm not entranced by the model of history as a linear progression, which is a very Enlightenment notion. That we're moving inexorably through science and knowledge towards the omega point of quite the opposite seems to be true. We seem to be more and more plunged into darkness and superstition, and that includes a lot of science, which is riddled with all sorts of problems. Yeah,
it is.
Anyway.
But I do feel that people are looking back to these other ways of seeing the world that you presented, and as you've mentioned, it's right through from kind of Greeks and Romans, even through up to the medieval period, until we sort of happened upon later developments in the Enlightenment, and of course many of us really connect in with the Romantics view, because at a time of great change, as we are in now with digitalization, and of course they were in going in sort of we had the Enlightenment industrial period later. We are like the Romantics, kind of tapping back into nature in that way. I think a lot of people really do resonate with the way that the Romantics saw the world, and I'm hopeful. And as you say, we'll see what happens, because we're always surprised by what happens next, aren't we? Really, it's never a dull moment.
But I certainly join you in a wish that the sacred will be. We live in such a profane world that anything that tends towards the re-sacralization, what a horrible word, of nature and the things that really matter, and indeed of things like soul and imagination, would be welcome as far as I'm concerned. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what my books are a long paean of hope that might happen, I think. Yeah.
I do hope so too. Thank you. And do you have any plans for writing?
I'm writing something at the moment, but it's
fantastic.
Well, it's not a book. It's too short to be a book, and it's too long to be an essay. And I've returned to anthropology again because yes, I've been looking at sort of modern advance in anthropology, and I'm finding it absolutely fascinating. And it's almost unknown outside its own discipline because it's couched in such appalling, esoteric, intellectual French language, that it's nearly impenetrable to the layman. So if I can just do a modest job in translating some of the bits of it that I really like, I'll have done enough, I think. Yeah.
Oh, that's marvelous. I really look forward to that.
It always opens out. That's the trouble. I've got the sort of mind that I do one thing and then I have to do it, and then it reminds me of another thing, and the next thing I've written another bloody great book.
Exactly. Well, please do keep going.
Well, good luck with your book, Jo.
Thank you.
I look forward to reading it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good,
you.
Yeah.
And thanks very much for taking your time to speak to me as well.
Thank you for having me, Jo. Thank you.
Thanks. And the best place to get you is
www.harpur.org/Patrick.
Lovely. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
And
all right,
I'll speak to you soon. Bye.
Yeah, bye.